But if we want to get men back, we have to skew intentionally toward the masculine. And let me show you why. Because women are very comfortable in the world of men. I've got a picture here of a female construction worker. She's got her hard hat on, she's got her tools, she's got her high-vis vest. We think nothing of seeing a woman in a typically male environment. Now, here's a photograph of the most horrifying thing that could happen to a man. My wife, Gina, is shopping and she says, "Honey, hold my purse for a minute."
Hello, gentlemen. My name is Paul Robson. I'm the founder of Manifesto, and this is a talk from David Murrow, the author of Why Men Hate Church. And I really found this interesting. The presentation which David gave was really, I think, designed for church leaders, where he obviously gives talks regularly. So it wasn't really aimed at us in Manifesto as a kind of audience, but it really gave a lot of insight into the state of the Protestant church today, I think. And it provoked a lot of discussion because there's a lot of guys in our group who, for various reasons, criticized and didn't like the talk either. I personally really didn't like the answer to the question which I asked at the end of this video, which I felt really illustrated how the Christian church has been influenced by secular materialism and now points to science as a way of trying to prove God or something like that, which I think is a terrible idea. Really, I've also appreciated David coming in and sharing, and he really shared himself and his heart in our really intense discussion that we had after his talk as well. So I think it really underlined for us Manifesto as a place where we have differing opinions and we get presented with ideas which we don't agree with. And there's an opportunity to talk about those. And so that's something that's really strengthened our community and our understanding of how we deal with this kind of thing, especially in our very kind of conflict avoidant Scandinavia, where a lot of the men live. So if that sounds like something you'd like to join, then you can watch this video, but even better that you can sign up for Manifesto Core, and join in more of these kinds of discussions. Yeah, just we're learning to become better men by also talking about the things that we disagree with and presenting our own vision of things instead. So without further ado, here's David Murrow.
So I wrote a book about 15 years ago called Why Men Hate Going to Church. And I'm not a pastor or any sort of religious professional. I'm just a guy in the church pews who always wondered why there were more women than men in church. And when I would, invite my male friends to church, they would often, yeah, no, not, I don't think so. Their attitude was that church was not for them. So being a television producer, I thought, well, there must be a demographic reason here because every television show is either targeted at men or women. And one day I was sitting in church and kind of realized the target audience of my church was probably not a guy, it was probably a gal. And so did some research and was fascinated by what I found. And I'm just going to take about 20 minutes here and walk you through the reasons why I've discovered why men hate going to church. But first, I would like to introduce you to my wife, Gina. We live in Alaska. That white stuff is called snow. And we also kill our own food there. That we went fishing this summer. There's some nice silver salmon. Our friend there on the left has a halibut. And you can see we really enjoy getting out in the outdoors. Alaska is a very manly state. 1 out of 8 men in our state is a licensed pilot. We don't have very many roads, so we fly everywhere. And we regularly encounter bears and moose, and so it has kind of a macho reputation. And to a large degree, that is true. And that's another reason why Alaska is probably the least religious of the 50 United States, is because manliness and religiosity do not go together very well in the West. So I'm going to start you off with a pop quiz here. I've got on the screen, I've got 2 sets of values. And the question is, which set of values best characterizes those of Jesus and his true followers? Now on the left, you can see the values there are competence, power, competition, achievement, skills, proving oneself, objects, goal orientation, and success. On the right, we've got love, communication, beauty, relationships, support, nurturing, feelings, sharing, and harmony. Now, if I were speaking to a live audience, I would ask for a show of hands. How many of you believe it's the left set? And typically, nobody or almost nobody would raise their hands. When I ask about the right set, almost everyone raises their hands. And whether that group is religious or not, more people are comfortable assigning the right set of values to Jesus than the left set. And then I tell my audience where those come from. They're from chapter 2 of the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And in that book, Dr. John Gray identifies the left set as the values that naturally come to men, whereas the right set are the values that naturally come to women. So we can see right away there is a perception that the values that men naturally embrace tend to be seen as worldly, whereas the values that naturally come to women are seen as Christian. So there's a perception gap right away in what it means to be a Christian and what it means, or even who Jesus is. Now, a few quick facts on the gender gap. Many of these are taken from the United States. I know many of you are tuned in from different places around the world. I don't have data on world religiosity, but I understand in many cases the gaps are even larger. The average church in North America draws an adult crowd that's 61% women. And I do know that many Asian churches are up to 90% women in participation. Here in the US, more than 20% of married church-going women worship without their husbands. We even have a name for them, the Sunday morning widow. She's in church, he's not. Here in the States, women are much more likely to attend Sunday school in small groups. They are 67% of the Christian radio audience. They buy about 75% of the Christian books and products associated with the church. They comprise about 80% of the non-ordained church staff and volunteers. And a study found that they lead, pray, disciple, witness, study, and give much more than men do. Young single men are practically an endangered species in church today. When I speak to men's group, I ask for a show of hands. How many of you were raised in church? Hands go up all over the room. And then I ask, how many of you abandoned the church during your teens and 20s? And almost every hand remains up. There's a period where men abandon the church. And that gap seems to be getting worse. The rise of the religious nuns here in the United States is growing by about 1% a year, and men are the most likely to be a religious nun. As I said, fewer than 30% of the boys being raised in church remain faithful to their teens and 20s. It's a time in which church and Christianity does not speak to their hearts. Now, when you ask men about God, belief in God, it's not atheism. 90% of men believe in God and 60% call themselves Christians here in the US, but fewer than 20% can be found in church on a given Sunday. So there's a gap between belief and participation. Now, when I speak to reporters or different researchers, often this question will come up. Aren't men just less religious than women? Well, the fact is Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism, the three other major world religions that rival Christianity in size, experience no similar gender gap. And in fact, the world's fastest growing religion is actually male dominated. Do you know what the world's fastest growing religion is? Anybody?
Islam, I guess.
Islam. And in fact, it inspires fanatical devotion among men. The more religious you are in the Islamic world, the more manly you are. And of course, if you've read the New Testament, you can see the early church had no shortage of men. Their blood is spilled on every page of the New Testament. So this brings up a question. Why is Christianity the only major world religion with a man shortage? Every other religion is roughly 50-50. Worldwide, Christianity runs in 60-40 or even worse. So let me just break this down into how an organization, I'm going to put on my sociologist hat here. If you're talking about voluntary associations, there are two ways to draw in new adherents. Either your organization has a positive reputation and people come, or by invitation, a person within that organization invites someone else. Now, the church has problems both with reputation among men and among invitation. And let me break that down into three parts here. The three reputational barriers are: men believe the church will feminize them. They believe that church is complete BS. It's either corrupt or crazy because of what they hear about it in the media. And then we have a rise of what's called in the States MGTOW. Anybody know that term? Men going their own way, men rejecting institutions. Now let's dive into each of these three very quickly. There is a widespread belief among young men, particularly more masculine leaning men, that church feminizes them. And if you think about it, the ways that men have traditionally proven their manhood is through things like promiscuity, heavy drinking, cursing, fighting, risk-taking, partying, etc. But when you become a Christian, you must put those behaviors away and become more gentle, more studious, more public displays of emotion, particularly if you attend what we would call a spirit-filled church where there's a lot of hallelujahs and amens and lots of singing. And so the church culture really reflects a set of values and behaviors that is uncomfortable for a lot of men who are at that point where they're trying to establish themselves as men and prove their manhood to their tribe of guys. It's BS. You know, I hope you all know what that means. I try not to use those words on video, but a lot of men think that church is complete BS. And that is driven by the new media. We have now a 24/7 media, internet, and cable television outlets that constantly need controversy. There are more media outlets than ever. Reporters tend to be trained skeptics. Reporters also politically tend to skew liberal, and Christians tend to skew conservative. So there's a natural antipathy between reporters and Christians and religious people. So as a result, reporters are going to focus on corrupt and crazy Christians to make their headlines. Now, I don't believe the church is any more corrupt or crazy than it's ever been, but because there are so many media outlets looking for controversy, they will go straight to the guy who says the world is ending tomorrow, or the pastor who was caught having an affair with one of the men on his staff. They're going to look for that incendiary stuff, put that front and center. Men look at this, and men are typically very they have what I call a BS detector. They're much more skeptical about things than women tend to be. And they're going to say, church is just a bunch of hypocrites. They don't realize there's this one pastor who screwed up. There's 99 who are very faithful and serving. And so the media tends to amplify the failings of every institution, not just the church. And unfortunately, that has put a barrier between men and church. Men are also withdrawing from all sorts of institutions. It's not just the church. Men here in the United States are now only about 1/3 of college graduates. Men are withdrawing from careers. The able-bodied male unemployment has never been higher than it is right now. About 1 in 5 American men simply is not working, and most of them are at home playing video games. It's a huge thing here. Men are withdrawing from government, from labor unions, clubs, and civic organizations. In my father's organization, every man was involved in a club, the Lions Club, the Elks, the Kiwanis, and that's just not happening anymore. And of course, marriage and family. Fewer men are married now than have ever been as a percentage of our population. So men are withdrawing from everything, not just from the church. Here are a few of the invitation barriers. And this is why the men who do go to church aren't inviting their friends. They don't think their buddies would like it. The sermons and the music tend to be repellent, and it's hard for a man to win at church. Let me break those down real quick. Oh, well, I don't have another slide for that. This is a new part of my presentation, excuse me. There's a lot of men out there who like their church, but when they think of inviting their friends, they think, I don't think my buddies would like this. I don't think they could relate to it. And so they don't invite their friends. 80% of people who eventually end up attending and joining a church do so at the invitation of a friend. And so, a lot of guys are just reluctant to invite their friends, and sermons and music have a lot to do with it, but I really want to focus on this one at the bottom. It's hard for a man to win at church. Now, you didn't realize church was a competition. Well, let me tell you something about men. Everything we do is a competition, and if we can't win, we don't want to play. When I was a young man, I briefly took up the game of golf. You've heard of Tiger Woods, right? Well, I spent most of my time in the woods looking for my ball. I am not a very good golfer, and so after just a few rounds, I did what men do. I quit golfing. I knew I was never going to be good at it. This same thing is going on with church. When we put a man and a woman in a church, a woman will often be better at it than a man. And so he leaves the religion to his wife, and he goes and he does something that he's good at. And to prove this, I've got a fun little contest here. I call this Tina versus Tom at church. And what we're going to do is have a 10-round contest to see who's the best churchgoer. So, and I've got a little scoreboard down here at the bottom. So one of the things the churches relentlessly push is small groups, small fellowship groups, midweek groups, Sunday school classes, etc. So when you enter into a Christian small group, one of the first things you've got to be good at is you've got to be a good reader. So here we are, we've got this Bible study group. Tom, Tina, and their friends are reading from their Bibles. Here, let's zoom in for a close-up here. They're all reading from their Bibles. Well, here's the fact. Men are diagnosed with reading disorders at 4 times the rate of women. And so if we ask the average man to read aloud and the average woman to read aloud, oftentimes the man is embarrassed. especially if he has an old King James Bible or an old translation that has words he may not know, if English is his second language, or if his literacy is not as good as the women next to him. I know several men who have dropped out of Bible study groups simply because their English skills were not that good. And so at the end of the round, it's Tina 1, Tom nothing. Small group skill number 2 is this, speaking and expressing ideas, and it looks like this. Well, here's the fact. Women outscore men in tests of verbal fluency. If you have a regime where men and women are equally invited to share, women are more likely to talk than men are, unless you have a few highly verbose men in the group. And that makes our score Tina 2, Tom nothing. Small group skill number 3 is finger dexterity. Now, this used to be very important in church, but it's less so these days because what we used to do is pass out Bibles and people would have to find their passages in the Bibles and the women would always get there first. You can see Tom struggling a little bit with those sausage-like fingers he's got there. Well, here's the fact. Women will often get to the passage quicker in a paper Bible, but digital Bibles are helping men find the passages. So we don't have to worry that much about this anymore. But that does make our score 3-0. Now, before you even get to church, there's a couple of very important skills that you have to master. And the first one is socializing, and it looks like this. Now, I don't know about you, but my wife is a master of small talk. She can walk into a room and instantly, within 5 minutes, be sharing every secret of her heart with the women she meets. Men, not so good at small talk. But when you get to church, you're supposed to be good at socializing. And the fact is, women are generally better at this, and that makes our score Tina 4, Tom nothing. Before and after skill church number 2 is this, hugging. And I think you're going to love this slide. A lot of churches here, especially in the States, I don't know over where you guys live, but hugging is a very important thing. I think all I can say is thank God for the pandemic and those 1.5 meters we now have to stand apart. So, but there's certain guys in the church just love to lock up. The minute they see you, you know you're a goner because you're going to get a hug. Well, the fact is many men are uncomfortable with man-to-man hugging, especially among strangers. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong for men who know each other, good friends to hug. That's perfectly fine. What I'm talking about is a culture where every man gets a hug from every other man. That can be uncomfortable, especially in light of what the media talks about when it mentions church. It's almost always about some form of sexual abuse, some priest fondling boys or whatever. And that's what all men ever hear about church. And they finally come to church, and guess what? Every man comes and tries to hug them. And so they start to think the rumors are true. So it can be problematic. And that makes our score Tina 5, Tom nothing. Now let's get into the worship service. This is where Tom's going to make his big comeback. Worship skill number 1 is singing. Christians sing more than any other religion on the planet. And so we can see Tom and Tina, they've got their songbooks there. They're singing to the Lord. Well, the fact is men won't sing songs they don't know. And there has been a marked movement away from hymnals toward reading the songs off the screen. Well, so we've gone from about 200 songs everyone knows to 200,000 songs nobody knows. And so when I go to church, I look around and I see most of the men are not singing. They're standing there with their hands in their pockets while the band rocks out and the smoke machine belches into the lights and everything. And it kind of looks like a rock show, but with the disadvantage, men love rock shows, but they want to know the song. And so men are not singing in church, and that makes the score Tina 6, Tom nothing. Women seem to give it a try, but men are like, I don't know this song, and they don't sing. Worship skill number 2 is this, showing emotion. Tina's got her hands raised, tears going down her cheeks. Tom is reluctant to do that. The fastest growing wing of the church right now is the Pentecostal, the so-called spirit-filled churches, particularly in the global South, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa. There's heavy emphasis on showing emotion in church. This would be crying out, hallelujah, lots of weeping, maybe even passing out at the altar. And so these public displays of emotion are associated with the presence of God. Now, I'm not speaking against these things. When God comes upon a man, you may pass out. You may speak in tongues. You may show a lot of emotion. However, there's always been, at least in Western society, an expectation that a man will keep his emotions in check. Here in the United States, we have a saying, big boys don't cry. Yet in the church, the person who cries is the person who is seen as being the most under the influence of God. And so we have a disconnect between what is expected of men and what is expected of Christians, and it makes it a lot easier. Women don't pay a price for showing emotion in public here in the US, but men do. The example I like to give is if you're walking down the street, you see a woman in tears by the side of the road, your immediate instinct is to help her. Poor thing, what's the matter? If you see a man dissolved in tears, your immediate thought is, what's his problem? Come on, buck it up, man, be a man. So it's just a higher hurdle for a man to show emotion in public, and that makes our score Tina 7, Tom nothing. Worship skill number 3 is this, holding hands. Just take a look at this slide, see what these men are thinking. Now, again, this is another one that the pandemic may have finally put driven a sword through this one, and I certainly wouldn't mind holding hands going away, but boy, 20 years ago when I was a young Christian, gosh, every time we got together, let's pray. Out came the hands, and I would just pray that I was standing next to a woman and not to a man, because here's the thing, dudes don't like holding hands with other dudes. I don't need research to tell me that. So at the end of that round, the score is Tina 35, Tom nothing. Boy, don't make your men hold hands. Worship skill number 4 is this, sitting still. Tina looks like she's doing pretty good. Tom looks like he needs to scratch something. Well, here's the fact. Men have 10 times the testosterone that women do. It makes us fidgety. It makes us want to move around, especially young men. Church services are getting longer and longer. When I was a boy, church was typically over in about 40, 45 minutes. The church I attend now in Alaska typically will go anywhere from an hour 15 to hour 30. And here's the big reason why churches services are getting longer. It's because of our sermon length. They really test our attention span. Now, I've got a series of photographs here that were taken during an actual service. Here, this is during a sermon. And we're 5 minutes into the sermon. You can see everyone's heads are up. 10 minutes, oh, we're still okay. Eyes are going down a little bit. 15, oh, heads are going down. Here's 20 minutes. And 25 minutes. So here's the fact. Sermons are much longer than they've ever been. And I could tell you the reasons for it. It's kind of an involved thing, but basically sermon length has doubled since the 1950s. I think it's driven a lot by the celebrity preacher movement. These really good speakers speak for a long time. Pastors at smaller churches say, hey, he preaches an hour, I'm going to preach an hour. And before you know it, you've got a church full of sleeping men. So our final score is Tina 37, Tom nothing. So why does Tina win at church? Is she a better Christian? Does she love God more? No. If that fact is, women are more likely than men to possess the skills that are valued in church. They're more verbal and they're better at teaching usually. They have more relational skills. They're good with children, volunteering in the nursery and these sorts of things. Tom loses at church not because he's a bad guy, but because his gifts are largely unwanted and unneeded. He feels he has little to contribute, and so he becomes passive and pulls away. So do men realize why they hate church? No, but they're going to give you excuses. They're going to say things like, they ask for money too much. It's boring and irrelevant to my life. I don't need church to be a good person. I don't like preachers. Church isn't for me. And of course, the big one, there's too many hypocrites. But if you look at this list of excuses, these apply to women as well. They don't explain the gender gap. What the men are saying is, I feel unwanted and unneeded in church. You really don't need men here. There's only one man you need, and that's the pastor and his army of women. So this process begins early, and we're almost done with our presentation, then I'll take your questions. Boys actually start losing in church at a young age. The rules of Sunday school are read aloud, verbalize, sit still, memorize, look up passages in books, and receive verbal input from a female teacher. So if you put a boy, a 10-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl under that regime, who's going to do better, the girl or the boy? Usually the girl will. And so by the time the boy reaches age 10, he's already convinced he just can't cut it in church. It's something for his sister. And so when I was a kid, there was nothing else to do on Sunday morning, but today church is no longer the most entertaining thing. We've got cable TV, we've got video games, we've got sports leagues, we play soccer, what you guys would call football. It's actually very popular among the young here. And we've got soccer leagues and hockey leagues that play on Sunday morning now. And so boys simply do what they're good at. The way we portray Jesus to children has changed. When I was a kid, he was always out doing adventurous things with men. We saw pictures, these were called holy pictures in Sunday school. Jesus was doing adventurous things with dudes. But a few years ago, the images of Jesus changed. Now most of the Sunday school images show Jesus hanging with children. Now, the fact is, Jesus did not spend a lot of time with children. He spent most of his time with men. But if you show boys pictures of Jesus hanging out with children, what's the impression they get? Jesus is for children. And when a boy reaches a certain age, 15, 16, and he's desperate to prove his manhood and put childish things behind him, what does he put behind him? Christianity, it's for kids. I'm going to put that behind me. And so that's why we see, one of the reasons we see a lot of attrition among young boys, teenage boys, is because they just think, I don't want to be a kid anymore. I'm not going to be a Christian. Youth group used to be the place where men re-engaged with the church, but today's youth groups are becoming a music-centered experience. They're mini church services with a praise band and a sermon from the youth leader. They tend to be stage-driven, just like church services. There's a lot of sitting, talking, and relating instead of playing around. When I was a kid in youth group, we used to play a lot of, ball games and, do physical things, and then we'd settle down for our talk when we were exhausted and sweaty. We don't do that anymore. We sing and then we listen to a speaker. There's not a lot of body movement, and here's the fact: by their senior year, girls are 21% more likely to be involved in a youth group. There's also a lot of feminine imagery in the church. I could go on and on. I'm just going to give you one example here, but let's take it from the movies. Now, when you men, those of you who are married and you choose a movie to watch at the theater or Netflix, men typically watch a movie that reflects their fantasy. In that movie, a hero defeats a bad guy and saves the world. If you like the Marvel movies or the James Bond movies or the Ethan Hunt, the Mission Impossible or Jason Bourne, we love those action pictures. I'll be back. There's always a hero who saves the world. That's because that's the fantasy that's on our hearts. Every man wants to be a hero. Every man wants to be recognized as valuable and a savior to stand on the side of right against evil. Now, when my wife picks out a movie, she usually picks a very different kind of movie. Can you guess what that is? Here in the States, we call them chick flicks, and they reflect every woman's fantasy. And in those movies, a heroine finds a personal relationship with a man who loves her. Nothing explodes, no one dies. Now, men, do you like these movies? They seem pointless to me. Why would I sit there for an hour and a half and watch this couple have all these romantic misadventures and then kiss at the end? It doesn't reflect my fantasy. It's not who I want to be. It's not really the life I want to live. I want to go out there and save the world. Now, listen to what's happened in the church in the last 50 years. In today's church, we no longer describe the gospel as a dangerous mission. We describe it as a personal relationship with Jesus. And so by explaining that Christianity is a relationship with a man who loves you, we are reflecting women's views of the world and not men's, even though the Bible itself is one of the most crazy, wild adventure stories you could ever read. So when people always are starting to push back, they're feeling uncomfortable. They say, Murrow is a misogynist. I'm not a misogynist. It is not about creating a male-dominated church or creating some artificially macho church. We don't need hand-to-hand combat during the offering time to bring more men back into church. What we do need to bring about is a balance. I hope I've made the point that so much of today's church is feminine and it's causing men to lose interest. But if we want to get men back, we have to skew intentionally toward the masculine. And let me show you why. Because women are very comfortable in the world of men. I've got a picture here of a female construction worker. She's got her hard hat on, she's got her tools, she's got her high-vis vest. We think nothing of seeing a woman in a typically male environment. Now, here's a photograph of the most horrifying thing that could happen to a man. My wife, Gina, is shopping and she says, honey, hold my purse for a minute. You see, men don't want to be seen in public holding a purse. Why is that? A woman is perfectly comfortable being seen in public with a hammer, but a man doesn't want to be seen holding a purse. Here's what I call Murrow's ironclad rule of the genders. Women do masculine, but men don't do feminine. And so this brings us to the point. Wait a minute, I'm going to skip these slides. The point is, if we create a church where men feel comfortable, women will also come in. And this is been the secret of the mega churches. The fast-growing, the large churches that are 49% male tend to focus more on the men, and they realize they get the women and children in the deal. And so the dying churches tend to be heavily female. So anyway, that's pretty much concludes my presentation here. I would definitely like to hear your international and your perception as not being from the States. The States is a very religious nation. I know many of you in your countries, there's much lower level of participation of both men and women. And I would love to hear some of your questions. Before I go, I've got other books that are available online. You can download them to your Kindle if those are of interest to you. And what about, yeah, so there's my website, churchformen.com. I'm also building a new website. Churchformen.com is going to be redirected to davidmurrow.com very soon, where I'm going to be putting all my resources. And so if you're interested in communicating with me, you can reach out through Church for Men, have any questions or whatever.
So yeah, David, as you mentioned, so most of the guys here are from Europe. I actually saw a slide the other day which showed that the percentage of people per country that had an absolute belief in God, and it was a map of the whole world. And so in the US, you have, I think, something like around 60% for most states, 70%. Here in Europe, most countries, I think, with the exception of was it Georgia or Romania? Yeah, it's one of the, but
Yeah,
it was down on
Europe.
like 10 to 15% in Europe, most of the places. And that's very reflective of the group of people that we have here as well. So we've been having some very deep conversations here on Manifesto. We're occupied with this thing of the meaning crisis, and we can see that a lot of people are increasingly, it's not just the Christian church that is lost a masculine direction. It's the whole of Western society. Some people would argue that these things are connected to each other, of course, as well. But one of the things we've been talking a lot about is the need for connecting to a tradition. So as men are looking for more depth, we're seeing the chaos of, woke and all these other things washing over society. And so there's a need for connecting to something deeper. And so I think a lot of people are looking at Christianity with new eyes in some ways, and meeting some different, challenges and issues there. And obviously a picture of what Christianity is that comes from many of the aspects that you've mentioned as well. But I think the biggest one that a lot of guys meet is just the idea of faith in God. So I'm curious, what is your take on someone who sees that there's some value in Christianity, but hits this idea of faith and God and that kind of thing? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think if just actual belief in God, that God created the universe, that's a big hurdle for a lot of guys. And one of the things that I have been reading that has really strengthened my faith in God is just basic study of biology, the complexity of the cell. Even the smallest cell is a very complex machine. And even a lot of scientists are beginning to realize there is some sort of design here that over even a billion years. And the other thing is scientists have never been able to spontaneously create life in a lab, in a test tube, as the theory always was. There was the primordial soup and then a lightning bolt came down. Scientists have been trying for decades to replicate that, and they've never spontaneously created life in a lab. So even from a biological and scientific perspective, my degree is in anthropology. I'm not a short. Okay, well, I'll do this after the tape is off because I don't want to get people the more fundamentalist elements of the church angry at me. But I'm just saying that there is a good scientific argument for belief in a creator. Whether that's Christ or whatever, that's up to you. But I think at the basis, if you really study the complexity of life and how things interact, there is a very rational case to be made for a creator. The secondary question is God as we understand him. And for that, my faith is strengthened by looking at a map of the world. Those areas of the world where Christianity was the freely chosen religion of people, not imposed, but freely chosen, are the areas with the greatest tolerance, the greatest, the least amount of violence and the least amount of religious violence, the least amount of oppression of minorities. It pains me that wokeness has gone so far that it has, because it's really based in Christian values, but it's Christian values taken to an extreme, unmoored from Christianity. And that's where the insanity of wokeness is coming from. So kind of a long answer to your question, but if the problem is I don't believe in God. I would encourage you to read some of the literature surrounding scientific, it's called scientific creationism. Read the scientific case for there being a creator, and just start at that point. And I think you'll find that it's a very convincing case, and one that will cause you to give the idea that there is a God a second look.
By the persons that not going to search, and when you say that people are not non-believers, my experience is that when I ask people that are non-believers, they say, no, I'm a believer, but I don't believe in God. I believe in something else. They choose their own way of spirituality and find their own way. So is that a part of this masculinity where they don't fit into the Christian church and the finding their own way? So the question here is that if you have an experience of that, and do you concur to that idea?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's been studies of prominent atheists, and a lot of them had either bad relationships with their dads or experienced some sort of trauma at the hands of a man when they were younger. And so what they've done is they withdraw from the thing that hurts them. And the church represents either their parent, or God represents their father. And so they withdraw from that. And you often find that they withdraw not just from church, but as you said, from a host of different institutions. They will be what we'd call a loner. There was an old song 50 years ago, I am a rock, I am an island. And that would describe, it's a self-protection mechanism. I'm not going to interface with other men because they're going to hurt me. I'm not going to interface. There's actually an emotional barrier as much as an intellectual one, because they're building their lives completely upon themselves and not relying on anything else. I'm seeing a lot of that, especially among younger men. And we have a society that valorizes victimhood right now. You poor dear. You know, it's not about dusting yourself off and getting back into the ring. It's about wallowing in your hurt. And, you know, I know there's a certain amount of work that needs to be done. You need to visit your wounds. But once the wounds are cleaned, you need to get back in the ring. And I think a lot of young men don't know how to get back in the ring. So I hope that's kind of answers your question.